Episode 3, Grounded in Gold. Chapter 1, Heirloom Logic. The Testaxio market was a hymn to ripeness, pyramids of tomatoes, figs yawning open, basil that smelled like a promise kept. Lydia stood at a stall comparing two heirloom varieties, one with green shoulders, one blushing to sunset. She weighed them the way she weighed choices, thumb testing firmness, mind cataloging sauce potential versus salad shine. Quardy Bew holds shape in heat, a voice said to her left, calm as a level on wood. But the Costaludo has better acidity for balance. She turned. He was tall, sleeves rolled, a canvas tote embossed with a faint ring of flower as if he'd carried bread that morning and liked that the proof of it lingered. His face was handsome in a way that didn't ask you to say so, clean lines, eyes attentive, a mouth that twitched when data pleased him. Lydia, she said. He nodded as if memorizing it on a card in a library drawer. David. He had the steady presence of someone who trusts what his hands can do. He picked up a tomato, turned it end over end. Virgo, he added with a matter-of-factness that made her laugh. Taurus, she replied, unsurprised that the universe had arranged dual earth signs next to crates of fruit that cared about sun and soil. They tested olives at the next stall, then argued amiably about salt. He admired her exacting palate, she admired his refusal to bluff. He was a furniture restorer, he said, work that required patience, solvents, and reverence for clues in the grain. She curated art. He nodded like this explained the way she handled tomatoes and sentences. When the vendor sliced a Costaludo for them, they ate it plain, juice down their wrists, eyes on each other to confirm what taste had told them. Balance is not a theory, it is a mouthfeel. Calf, he asked, like a practical next step rather than a leap. They crossed to a stand where the barista tamped with priestly precision. David ordered 2 espressos and a glass of water to share, to reset, and she thought, finally, someone who understands ritual is not fuss, it is respect for outcome. They compared notes on knives and pans, oils and vinegar, brushes and glue. He listened without positioning himself to win. She spoke without needing to defend her preferences. When he described the pleasure of bringing a scarred tabletop back to usefulness, his hands shaped the memory in air. When she told him about designing a reading table to hold recipes like constellations, his gaze sharpened with interest, not performance. Before they parted, he bought her a bunch of basil, leaves small and fierce. Smell, he said, lifting it to her face. She did, and the scent felt like a key turning. Dinner, she asked, not coy. I'll bring a wine with enough spine to stand next to your tomatoes, he said, smiling in a way that suggested he would arrive 5 minutes early with the cork already considered. On her walk home, the market sounds thinned into the quieter logic of her street. She cradled the basil the way you cradle a beginning. Ground recognizes ground. Some meetings feel like a floor found underfoot after too much sky. Chapter 2, The First Ritual. He arrived at 7:25 with a Barbara he briefly, efficiently justified, acidity for the tomatoes, tannins gentle, cherry without jam, a paper-wrapped wedge of aged pecorino, and a tiny bouquet of marjoram because it's shy and useful. His shirt was crisp but not showy. His hair did what hair does when someone runs water and a comb through it and then stops. He noticed her knives, her seasoning tins labeled in tidy script, the way the cutting board had been oiled. He admired without intruding. He offered help without assuming. They cooked together like people who had done it before in other lives, her at the stove, him at the prep island, bowls of cut fruit and sliced fennel accumulating with neatness that didn't quash spontaneity. He asked where she kept the pepper mill. She told him, and he replaced it, facing the same direction, not to control the room but to be in conversation with it. They ate on her small balcony. The tomatoes sang, the oil hummed, the cheese made jokes about sheep and hills. Conversation moved in attentive arcs and returned with something added. He asked questions that weren't traps, she answered without needing to polish. He admired her elegance, the unlabored way she combined textures in a plate, the calm with which she corrected her own oversalted vinaigrette. She respected his intellect, visible in the precision of his compliments. You layered temperature, he observed of the meal, so nothing shouted. It felt like he'd offered a metaphor for how they might speak to each other. When the plates were stacked, he stood to help, checking first with a glance. She nodded. In the kitchen, their shoulders brushed, an incidental contact that sent a bright, grounded current through both. He did not pounce on it, she did not flee it. He dried a bowl completely before placing it in the cabinet. The small rightness built trust disproportionate to its size. They moved to the sofa, wine half full. He reached for her hand in a way that was less conquest than confirmation. The first kiss was patient and exacting, an act of attention as much as of yearning. He kissed like he restored, gently, testing, learning the object's history, refusing to force. She responded with a steadiness that let heat bloom without scorch. When she drew him closer, he followed with respect, not rush. Their bodies discovered a tempo like a good waltz, measured, increasingly sure, able to turn without dizziness. They didn't make love that night. The decision felt less like restraint than craftsmanship. They let want become wine in the glass swirled, oxygen invited, notes opening. He left at 10:40 after checking tram times on his phone. At the door he said, "I like that the salt lives next to the stove where it belongs." It was a compliment disguised as a remark, and she received it as such. She washed the last glass and felt the ordinary holiness of a counter wiped clean. Routines, she thought, are the scaffolding of tenderness. He seemed to understand that. The basil in the jar breathed, the night settled. She slept deeply, as if someone had finally turned the mattress to the right side and aligned the corners. Chapter 3: The Slow Pour. They texted in a grammar of competence and care. Morning, a photo of his workbench clamps, sandpaper, a drawer front mid-sanding, caption Tuesday. Her reply, a snapshot of the gallery floor plan annotated with pencil, arrowed pathways for flow. Afternoons brought practical notes, bread proofing, dinner at yours if you like, meeting runs till 6, bring patience and olives. When they flirted, it was through specifics. Your Messian place is indecent, he typed once. She laughed aloud. Their second weekend, he took her to his studio. Sunlit motes of sawdust as if confetti had learned manners. He ran a hand along a walnut table he was coaxing back to dignity. "See the cathedrals?" he asked, showing her the grain's upward arcs. She did, and he beamed, not at being right, but at being understood. He had built a small shelf for clamps that freed a corner for light. She admired the solution as though it were art because it was. When he lifted a lid from a vat, the linen's lemon tang rose. "Homemade oil and wax finish," he explained. "Food safe, non-yellowing." He didn't brag, he reported. She asked if she could smell his brushes, the natural bristle, the ghosts of varnish, and he handed them over like talismans. They stood close enough that their breath entered the same region of air. His hand found the small of her back, not possessive but orienting. Her body answered with a certainty that traveled up her spine and settled behind her eyes. That night they slipped from kissing into bed like a sentence completing a clause. Intimacy unfolded with the rigor of kindness. They were unhurried and alert, talking in touches rather than speeches. He learned her cues and retained them. She learned his patience and matched it. When he unbuttoned her blouse, his fingers were sure and respectful. When she traced his shoulder, she felt both strength and willingness to be guided. They let silence do a portion of the work, their breath the metronome. The sensuality was slow, layered, and thorough, heat building without clatter, pauses used to taste, a cadence that trusted arrival more than spectacle. The bed became a field they tended together, pressure adjusted, boundaries checked by eye contact that asked and answered without drama. When they reached release, it was shared and quiet, like a chord resolving exactly when ears and bodies had asked for it. After, he handed her water before she asked. She tucked the sheet around his hip because the air had cooled. These small exchanges felt like vows. They dozed. Later, he turned to her again with a question in his eyes. She nodded. The night opened a second time. If their first time had been a slow pour, their second was decanted, notes breathing, expression deepening, intimacy less careful only because trust had accrued interest. When sleep finally held them, it felt earned rather than surrendered to. In the morning, he made coffee precisely and buttered toast all the way to the corners. "Corners matter," he said, deadpan, then smiled for real when she squeezed his wrist in agreement. This, she thought, was a love that liked to be useful. She suspected it would age well. Chapter 4: Building the Week. The weeks arranged themselves into rituals that felt like a life rather than a performance of one. Market Saturday. His studio Sunday morning, her gallery Sunday afternoon. Monday pasta with whatever vegetables had insisted on coming home. Tuesday bread. Wednesday stretching on the rug while a playlist of piano nocturnes made the room breathe evenly. They didn't collapse into each other so much as interlock, two calendars trading notes, two kitchens borrowing tools. He created space for her creativity as if it were part of the architecture. When she was drafting a grant proposal, he left her a sharpened pencil and a neatly folded cloth for screen cleaning. When she paced through an installation problem, he listened and then asked exactly one question that let the stuck piece turn. She, in turn, respected his concentration, bringing tea at the 90-minute mark because that's when his shoulders tightened, setting a timer not to interrupt again until the chime. "You guard my focus," he said once. "You honor mine," she replied. Their intimacy lived inside these patterns and gave them lift. Some nights were a shoulder pressed as she read, some were a touch that lengthened into an evening of breath and murmurs, some were a hand held under a table during a tedious meeting-turned dinner with donors. The sensual was never separate from the practical, it flavored it. She loved the way he undid his watch before kissing her, as if to remove measurement from the room. He loved the way she matched his pace and occasionally, deliberately, changed it. When they disagreed, they did it like artisans, over spice ratios, over whether to refinish a table fully or keep the scuffs as history, over how many guests could fit before conversation diluted. Their voices rose only to the level required for clarity. They paused to define terms, they conceded when persuaded. Once, after a particularly nerdy debate about soffritto size, he drafted a grid on paper and they tested cubes. They laughed at themselves, but not cruelly. The result was delicious. He met her friends and did not perform competence, he simply was competent. He asked her best friend about her pottery glazes and stayed for the answer. He replaced a loose hinge on the friend's cabinet without announcing it. Loyalty in him looked like maintenance, small, consistent corrections that keep things true. In her, loyalty looked like witness. She saw him doing these things and named them so they would not disappear. They slept well together because they respected the bed, 2 pillows each, sheets tucked but not straitjacketed, a shared throw for reading. When she had a nightmare about missing a speech, he woke, turned on a low lamp, and asked her to tell him the dream in present tense so it could lose its teeth. When he had a bad day with a client who wanted speed instead of restoration, she poured him a small glass of Barbara, set down bread with anchovies, and said, "We eat first, then we decide what to say." They decided together. The week built itself like a sturdy shelf. On it they placed joys and plans. None of it felt like compromise, it felt like craft. Chapter 5: The Room We Tend. Autumn folded into Rome with a practical crispness. They began to host a weekly market supper, 3 friends, sometimes 5, never more than 8, the menu dictated by whatever produce had shouted at them that morning. He handled knives and heat, she handled plating and pacing, both handled welcome. It wasn't dinner theater. It was a room they tended, as one tends a garden, water, light, pruning, pleasure. Between these rituals, desire did its quiet, insistent work. Some afternoons, when the house was empty and the light threw clean rectangles on the floor, they'd meet each other as if noticing the geometry had increased the room's appetite. The way they touched felt like conversation about texture and tempo, the slow slide of a palm along a thigh, a pause to inhale the other's neck like basil, a recommitment to patience when urgency tempted shortcuts. They learned how to say please without words, how to say yes with breath. He kept a small bottle of oil and wax finish on his nightstand. She teased him about it until he used a drop on her wooden comb and turned the teasing into gratitude. She kept matches there too, for candles that warmed the air into honey. Intimacy could be as simple as him brushing her hair, as explicit as them undressing each other with a seriousness that made laughter after feel earned. They liked that their pleasure had a memory. It remembered what worked. It looked forward to learning one more thing. On a day when rain kept the city indoors, they stayed in bed late, mapping a future not with abstractions but with measurements. Could his studio expand if he sublet the back room? How might her next exhibit make room for hands, not just eyes? They didn't mandate each other's answers. They set up a table where both could put their work and imagine it bigger. When they turned from talk to touch, the shift felt like part of the same conversation, 2 kinds of making overlapping. They visited his parents in Trastevere for lunch, eggplant parmigiana that took no prisoners. His mother watched the way he refilled Lydia's water glass and smiled as if she'd spotted a trait that mattered. His father asked sensible questions and seemed pleased by sensible answers. There were no tests, only introductions to the systems that held him upright. On the way home, Lydia said, "Your mother plates like a general." He laughed. "She is one." That evening, back at her place, they stood at the counter eating leftover parm cold. He tucked a curl behind her ear then, as if continuing the day's string of small, correct gestures, kissed her, slow, certain, a promise that knew how to keep itself. They made love with an ease that didn't cancel intensity, hands firm where memory said yes, a soft word when adjustment would make the next moment better. The world narrowed to the space between their bodies and widened to include everything they were building: meals, shelves, a shared language. After they lay on their backs, fingers laced. "We're boring," she joked, testing. "We're consistent," he corrected, unbothered. "Consistency is how wine becomes itself." She turned her head, looked at him, and saw that he meant it. Relief relaxed something she hadn't known still braced. Chapter 6: When Friction Helps. Compatibility did not erase friction. It refined it. They discovered how they each approached money, she with a bias toward quality that lasts, he with a ledger that liked proofs. They compared calendars and found that her social appetite exceeded his by precisely 1 gathering per week. They negotiated chores and laughed at themselves for being adults who enjoyed discussing brooms. One evening, a real disagreement arrived. He had taken on a rush repair for a client she didn't trust. "He treats objects like trophies," she said. "But if the table returns to use, it will have one," David countered. She worried the client would push him past healthy hours. He believed he could set the terms. Voices didn't rise, stakes did. He went quiet to think, a habit that once would have frightened her. Now she let silence do its job. 2 nights late at the studio, he said finally. Not 3, I text when I stop, I accept no extra fee for speed. She nodded. And I bring dinner at 9, she added, not to rescue, to nourish. Agreement settled like a fitted lid. The work took precisely as long as he'd predicted, partly because she'd fed him soup that helped the hours keep shape. Later in bed, they considered how their difference, her protectiveness, his service, could make them better rather than brittle. Friction polishes, he said, palm warm on her back. As long as we use the right grit, she murmured into his shoulder. They kissed with the ease of people who had argued and then returned to the middle. Their sensual life benefited from such clarity. They treated desire as a craft project, iterative, attentive, forgiving. Some nights were slow builds with eye contact and whispered adjustments. Some were wordless, guided by the memory of what the other had reached for last time. He loved the way she set a pace and then surprised them both by changing it. She loved the way he made every movement feel intentional. If love was a workshop, their bodies were where the plans met the materials and proved themselves in use. They planned a short trip to the countryside, not as escape, but as maintenance. He wanted to look at cherry boards, she wanted to walk a museum with too few visitors. They booked a simple inn with good light. Even the anticipation felt like part of the relationship's architecture. Measurements taken, joints tested, the future dry-fitted. Before sleep, he set his watch on the nightstand, face down. She blew out a candle and set the matchstick across the holder like a small bridge. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. The word felt sturdy. Chapter 7, Shapes of Quiet. The inn room smelled faintly of chalk and time. They hiked a hill behind it and looked at a valley sculpted by patience and weather. In the lumberyard, David ran his palm over boards with the reverence of a monk blessing benches. This one will want to be a table that seats 6, he said, and she loved him for talking about the wood's desire rather than imposing his own. At a tiny museum, Lydia stood in front of a still life with pears so modest and exact she wanted to cry. Craft as devotion, David murmured, reading her face. They left a donation at the front desk and walked hand in hand back to the inn through air that knew when to cool. Their lovemaking that night was the room's temperature, neither hurried nor languid, exact and sensual. They kept the lamp low. He undressed her as if unwrapping a well-made object with respect for joinery. She held him as if positioning a piece so its grain would show. They paused when breath asked, they resumed when breath answered. The bed felt like a workbench where skill and affection collaborated, each improving the other. Release arrived like a whispered yes, not a shout, and their bodies understood it as completion rather than conquest. In the morning, she woke first and watched him sleep. Virgo at rest looked less calculating and more innocent than she'd expected. She traced the air above his cheekbone, not touching, as if blessing. He opened his eyes and smiled the way people smile when the day has already been kind. Coffee, he asked. Please, she said. He put water on and returned to the bed while it heated, slid under the sheet, and kissed her neck with the sort of focus that suggested some projects are best started before caffeine. She agreed. They drove home in a silence that felt like music. Back in Rome, life resumed the gentle friction of schedules. He installed new shelves in her pantry he designed to fit jars precisely. She labeled them. The system clicked. She drafted a new exhibit proposal. He edited the section headers for clarity and left her a note in the margin. You are very good at making people feel seen. She pressed the note into her recipe box under sauces where praise ages well. They noticed how their quiet fit. The market vendors began to treat them as a unit. Her friends ceded the sharpening of knives to David without ceremony. His mother called Lydia to ask about a glaze for carrots. Lydia called her back to ask about freezing stock. Concentric circles overlapped until neither of them could recall when exactly the other's life had started to occupy this much room, but it felt earned, not invasive. Chapter 8, Grounded in Gold. On a Sunday afternoon, they finally sat at the walnut table he had finished for them. The cathedral grain lifted as if prayer had become furniture. He had rubbed the oil and wax finish in with patient circles until the surface glowed like a held note. She set a bowl of chickpeas with lemon peel and rosemary on it, placed salad forks at the correct diagonal, and waited for the small pleasure of him noticing and approving. He did, not with a speech, but with a look that meant, we are two competent people making a shared life on purpose. They ate and talked about a future without dramatics. She would curate an exhibit on tools as art, as inheritance. He would take on fewer rush jobs and one apprenticeship. They would travel, but not to escape, to learn. They would save for a larger kitchen where knives could breathe and light could land on flour. He would build a bed frame from cherry. She would sew linen for the pillows. It sounded domestic because it was, and domestic was not a slur, it was a craft. That evening they hosted a small supper. 8 chairs, he had made them, held friends who felt more like infrastructure than company. Between second and third courses, she looked around and saw it clearly. This was a love that built, not broke. It constructed days that could bear weight. It fixed small things so big things could stay true. It knew the difference between spectacle and chose glow every time. After everyone left, they did the dishes in a rhythm that needed no words. He dried, she stacked. He wiped, she put away. When the counters were clean and the basil trimmed and rewatered, they stood in the quiet kitchen and rested their foreheads together. "Thank you for the table," she said. "Thank you for filling it," he replied. They went to bed with the slow respect that had become their signature. The intimacy was fine wine again, layers, patience, a finish that stayed. When they were done, they lay with the window open to the city's measured hush. He said, not as a flourish but as a fact, "I love you." She said it back like a promise that knew how to keep itself. Later, sleep came easily. In the dark, the new table held a bowl of lemons the color of small suns. The room smelled faintly of oil and citrus and something warm you can't buy. If there was gold here, it wasn't flashy. It was the steady shine of things used daily and cared for. Grounded in gold, she thought, and felt the words click into place like joinery done right. Like this video, subscribe, more stories like this are coming.